So welcome to the Industry 4.0 Club's Fireside Chat. This afternoon, our purpose is to engage the power of diverse worldwide talent to accelerate the global evolution to Industry 4.0. We accomplish this by hosting and supporting respectful, thoughtful, and interdisciplinary open conversations and creating quality content on wide-ranging Industry 4.0 topics to expand the reach of our community. We're glad you've decided to join us for today's Fireside Chat with Jane Arnold. Jane's going to be sharing her perspective on Industry 4.0 from her experiences both on the shop floor and the C-suite. My name is Mike Ungar, and I'm an Industry 4.0 co-founder. For the past 2.5 years, I've been a focal point business coach and executive coach. Prior to that, I spent 35 years at Michelin North America in a variety of continuous improvement, operations, finance, and human resource roles. I'd like to introduce you to our co-host today, Mike Yost. Mike, would you introduce yourself just for a moment, please?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. My name is Mike Yost. I'm, along with Mike, one of the co-founders of the Industry 4.0 Club. Happy to be a part of this. I've been in industry for well over 30 years, much of it spent in industrial automation, industrial software side of things. I am also co-founder of a company called Bennett, where we work to connect manufacturers with people with the domain expertise and solutions to help them solve their problems. So Jane is one such individual that I can't wait to hear from. So really looking forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So let me start by maybe introducing Jane a bit, and we'll let her add to this when we get to her in a second. So Jane is an industry executive with 30 years experience in chemical, discrete, and additive manufacturing. She's an Industry 4.0 digital leader passionate about improving manufacturing at the point of impact while embracing new technologies. Jane has held executive roles at Stanley Black & Decker and Covestro, leading digital transformation in manufacturing. She's passionate about improving manufacturing at the point of impact, as I mentioned earlier. She's an evangelist for a human-centric bottoms-up approach to scalable, sustainable improvements utilizing technology in manufacturing. Jane is a resilient individual with strong management and people skills, personal values, and technical knowledge. She's able to build strong relationships with business and functional leaders to influence decision-making across an organization. She's a champion of women and diversity, and particularly focused on improving that participation in STEM roles. So Jane, we're really glad you could join us today. We know you've got a lot going on, so thanks for joining us to share your insights. And one last comment before we get to Jane. As we get started, for those on LinkedIn Live, if you have a question for Jane, please share it in the comment section, and we'll try to answer it throughout the next hour. Jane, can you just tell us a bit more about yourself, add to what I shared already?
Certainly, and nice to see you again, Mike, and thank you for having me today. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So I started in manufacturing in the late 80s as a summer job and absolutely fell in love with learning how things worked. And I did not realize I had that engineering aptitude. Started off instrument electrical drafting, then design, and then went into process control systems and improved process control improvements with operations. I've had, really interesting experience with operations, working as an operator, as a unit lead, and as a plant manager or full production train lead. And, solving problems is what I love to do. And so I've had some great experiences, and I'm happy to share them with you. I've met a lot of really interesting people along the way.
Super. Well, just a quick, so obviously, being in manufacturing as long as you've been in that area of industry, how'd you get interested in Industry 4.0? I mean, this is in 30 years plus, we didn't start with the Industry 4.0. So how'd you get involved with that?
So when I moved, or when I was asked to be considered for the executive role at Covestro, heading global process control technology, that was one of the topics that came up in discussion. And at first I was just like, what is different? Well, we've been doing computer control for decades. Why are we suddenly doing something else? And I quickly learned that it's not just about computer control, but actually utilizing IoT, cloud technology, and doing advanced analytics on the data instead of just on the data on the shop floor. And so we found it, I found it really fascinating. We started looking at different ways that we could make improvements with advanced technologies in manufacturing at Covestro.
When you say you found different ways to make improvements, I know you mentioned more than just using the technology on the shop floor. Can you give me an example of just one of those aha moments for you as you started working with the new technology?
Well, it's one of the things, there's a lot of talk, or has been in the past, especially about IT/OT integration, and I really didn't fully appreciate what that meant. But if you're used to working in OT, where you've got a DMZ between the shop floor and then the business network, you need to work together with IT in order to actually be able to securely move that data and have a cloud environment and do the advanced analytics. And that was something that I had not considered before. I've always, thought about from the control board to the instrument in the field, but not really above and beyond that.
So, Jane, if I could jump in for a second, that point about the IT/OT convergence, I used to be part of Mesa International, and I remember in 2008, we were going to name the theme for the annual conference convergence, so the IT/OT convergence, and the board shot it down because they thought the term was overplayed. Right? We've been talking about it for so long that nobody wants to talk about that anymore. But here we are, like that's still
Yes.
an issue, right?
It is still an issue, and it's important. And even just, in the last few months, there have been discussions about who owns technology. Is it IT? Is it OT? And how does that work? And it has to be working together, because the OT professionals understand how the shop floor equipment works, or the control system. And the IT folks are maybe stronger on security and all the business systems. And you need to pair that together. You need to harmonize that data to work together to make improvements.
How about too the business, right? The plant. You mentioned being plant manager and running unit operations and being an operator, right? That the importance of that role, right? Those other lines, the IT/OT organization should be working in concert with, supporting the business itself, right?
Yes, absolutely. And throughout my career in different capacities, there's been a different emphasis on parts of the entire workflow process, starting from late 90s, where I actually worked as an operator, and then all the way through to an executive role. And the interactions that you have with people is really the key to success, because you have to work well together, consider everyone's opinion, their expertise, and make improvements working together going forward.
So has your experience been that, like when you started in this Industry 4.0 role, that the organization got that? And as you now work with other organizations, do you get that people are understanding that technology has a place, but it's not necessarily a shining star that we should be, focused on? What do you see?
Yes. So early, when Industry 4.0 was termed and came out, and all these vendors are developing software or pushing the software, it seemed to be more about the hype. And I saw a lot of companies buying into the hype, expecting magic to happen, and in that black box. But what you have to have with that is a strategy of implementation, which includes a very strong change management aspect, in order to be able to do that properly.
It's really interesting you talk about change management. One of the perceptions I have is and what I've seen is that one of the main reasons that some of these solutions fail is because change management is not taken into account.
Sure.
What are a couple things that when we talk about change management, it's kind of a buzzword itself as well. What are a couple things that you think about when you say change management that are essential for success?
So when I think about change management, and if you don't mind, I'll go back just a little bit. But I had mentioned that I worked as an operator before, and that was in the late '90s. There was a union strike and lockout, and I actually ran the board because I was well trained in the process and in the systems. And I realized that the operator knows more than anybody else because there's this nuance to running the control that the engineers and supervisors, managers don't see because they're not there, knee deep in it every day. And so as I started to look at the Industry 4.0 execution, I'm like, well, how do we get that operator input? We have to have that operator input. So we worked on, at Covestro, different ways to try to standardize the approach to engage operations, because you absolutely want to listen and you want to incorporate that feedback into your overall solution. And so we did an experiment at one of the sites where we kind of wrote blueprints for how that should work. But it's much different being the person sitting in the control room with an operator and then being over a large group of people in a lot of different facilities in order to try and do change management.
So if I want to get started with Industry 4.0, you mentioned your experience on the shop floor. When do I get the shop floor involved in that?
I would say from day one.
Yeah.
So my passion has always been, taking a look at what the operator does. And wherever the operator is struggling, that's your biggest point of impact, and that's where you should start. And the reason why I say that is because you have to get the workforce on board. Otherwise, you spend a lot of money and they're gonna find a workaround to do things the way they want to do them. But if you actually work with operations, find out what those pain points are, and solve that problem where the people have the biggest issue, then you're going to get this immediate, oh, thank you, I appreciate that. Let's fix the next problem, and it really grows from that individual shop floor worker's perspective.
So you're proposing, or you're suggesting, and I think it's I would concur, but just want to confirm. Go where the main challenge of the operator is, even if it's not your biggest business result gain, because that's going to get you to buy in to do more work later. Is that what I hear you saying?
That is what I'm saying. Now, each person in the organization is going to have a different perspective and a different pain point. So you could have the plant manager that's worried about turnover and having to retrain employees coming in. You could have a process engineer worried about boiler control or some other type of energy efficiency problem, and then you've got the shop floor worker who is having difficulty because the system doesn't work quite right. And by fixing those problems and focusing bottoms up, you actually make improvements all the way across the board. So if you think about an operator, we solved his biggest problem or hers, and then you take that, and that person is less likely to quit because his job isn't as bad as he thought it was, right? And then he's actually, or she is actually involved in helping make decisions and to drive that change. So then the plant manager is like, well, my attrition is improving. How did that happen? And so you can have all that go together. But when I approach a problem like before in the past, when I would go to a site or a unit, I would try and figure out, okay, here's your entire value stream, and what are the different pain points? Because it could be that other people are involved with solving some of those other pain points. But you absolutely have to involve the person with their hands closest to the process, because they really do know more than anybody else.
So when you engage with folks like that, do you come in wearing a technology hat? Do you come in with your Industry 4.0 badge on and say, I'm here to modernize things, or what's your approach?
I come in my jeans and work boots and t-shirts and with a cup of coffee, and I hang out and try and find out what's going on and try to relate to them. I grew up in this environment, and that's actually what I'm probably most comfortable in. And once they realize that you know what you're talking about, and when you ask questions, people usually want to help you understand, and you start that conversation and that engagement, and they're going to tell you where their problems are. And it's like, oh, I can fix that. We can do X, Y, or Z or whatever, and let's give it a try. And one of the things with Industry 4.0 is that, go ahead and try it. it's not, you can easily back up. You don't have to have it perfect before you start, but you should start.
And so, if you don't mind, just stick with that for just a second, because we talk about the perspectives, the difference in perspective from the operators to the C-suite, right? So, do you find that operators, if the way you're going to problem solve with them involves technology, their understanding of that, or does technology never even come into play? It's just a tool that you're going to give them regardless of.
So the technology definitely comes into play, and it's even possible that the operators have an idea because they're all online and they're all reading and they're all looking and talking to people, and they've got some ideas. They may not know what is standardized in the company, what sort of contracts are already in place, and the specifics of what the different software solutions, the problems they'll solve, but they'll definitely know what their pain points are. And I've made, now this is back in my DCS days doing advanced process control, but I've made numerous improvements by the operator saying, well, when this happens, this over here happens, and I don't like that. Can we fix it? And it's like, yeah. Sure. I mean, they wouldn't know how to write that code to do that, but they were able to articulate what the problem was. And then we would, work on it together and check it out together to make sure that everything satisfied the requirements. But you've got to have that engagement. And on another note, not everything is technology. Sometimes it's about material flow and making sure you've got your things in the right places between cells, but often there's a technology component to all of it.
You've hit upon something that's really important. It's really from my perspective, it's really using the right tool to solve the problem, not just hey, it's Industry 4.0. Sometimes technology, as you said, isn't the answer, right? It's
right.
Something simpler than that. But so you've just went through, and I think a really great explanation of how somebody might start their deployment of Industry 4.0. Why do you think so many companies are, especially small to mid-sized companies, are slow to get started on this Industry 4.0 journey?
Well, there's probably a few reasons. When you talk about small to medium enterprises, it could be that the price point just doesn't make sense for them. And there needs to be software that is scalable in such a way that when you start off small, your payment is also small. So that's one thing. And then also, the smaller companies may not have the workforce to be able to actually deploy people and do that. So then you have to hire a third party to do that as well. So that again becomes an expense issue. And then oftentimes, or at least I've heard throughout my career that I've heard people tell me, well, the people in the shop don't know how to fix the problem or don't understand the problems. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to tell them what they need, right? And if that's the attitude of the leadership, then it's never going to work. And I've seen that much more than I care to admit.
So if I'm a small or mid-sized manufacturer and I don't have this, you've worked in larger companies, and I as well, they don't have this continuous improvement group or this technology group to support them. That's all third party. Do they just go find a third party experts to help them, or tell me, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what I would do is if you happen to know someone in the industry that you trust, and try and get some feedback from them. And then there's also good organizations and groups that could help refer you to different individuals that could help you. And then, of course, Mike mentioned his Seeker Solver platform with Bennett. That might be one way as well. So, but it's you can't just go to Google and say, okay, I need help with installation, because you're going to get bombarded with a ton of people who want to help you. And it'd be good to have somebody that you knew that's been successful, and ask them how they did it. And what I've always done in the past is I go to different conferences like ARC or Connected Plant Conference or something like that, and just see what it is that people have done and how they approached it. Of course, now with discrete and additive, the conference list is much, much longer than it used to be, and I have to pick and choose.
I'm sorry, Mike, if I could jump in just for a second. If you could advise a company, regardless of size, because even what you just said, as far as you making time to go to conferences, educate yourself, et cetera, those are steps that I think people don't necessarily give enough credit for. Like, it's worth the organization's time to have somebody understand these things. And so maybe they're a smaller organization, like you mentioned, and they don't have the staff that can do those sorts of things. But I do think there are behaviors that have to change from the manufacturer's perspective, as far as, if it's not about adopting this technology or diving in, with both feet or whatever, if it's at least opening your thinking differently about how you're going to educate yourselves, that you have to educate yourself, right? That you have to be open potentially to different types of working arrangements, different type of partnerships, things like that. Are there any things that you see that from the manufacturer side that organizationally or behaviorally you think people would do themselves good by sort of losing some of the old habits and thinking differently about this stuff?
The as far as losing the old habits, I mean, I know that when I moved from being a control expert to operations and then in the senior leadership role, it was tough for me to make that change and to let go what I knew and actually say, okay, this is not a DCS problem, or it's not my DCS problem, but I have a different role and how to do that. And the more that I network and talk to people, and so you don't have to go to a conference for this. And then with the pandemic, you can find everything online and webinars and stuff to watch. But the more I network and talk to people, the more ideas that I have, and actually the more open I am to different ways to solving problems.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're spot on that certainly the pandemic played a role as well. Because two things that I talk to people about regularly, I saw the pandemic change, or the disruption caused by the pandemic change, was this conversation that for years we've had about fear of technology and automation and displacing workers. Like, that went away because we don't have enough workers, right? We have to make the people that are working for us today more effective, to take on more responsibilities, right? Empower them with those sorts of tools. But the other thing that I saw firsthand was people more willing to look for help from different places. And, can you connect us with somebody? Can we talk to a Jane, pick her brain for a while, right? Like, how do we expand and get access to expertise in different ways? So I agree with you on that front.
I was going to just to tag on to take what you're talking about, Mike, and follow up on something Jane said earlier. You mentioned getting to see other groups and getting out there to get support. When we talk about the ecosystem that's out there to support small and mid-sized manufacturers, what are some of the strengths you see, and what are some of the areas that need to be strengthened in that area?
So I haven't spent a whole lot of time yet in this space, but I do know that there are organizations underneath Manufacturing USA and different universities that they're working on consortiums and to try to improve manufacturing. I still see that there's a gap in those organizations with small and medium enterprises. So I think it's going to take all the experts in different areas to actually sign up with the Chamber of Commerce and say, hey, I can help you and help you, spend a day and talk to you about what you need to do. Yeah, I'm not really sure. The small and medium enterprises make up 80% of manufacturing in the US, and most of those are 20 people or less. And so that's really hard to get them to change and actually invest in technology. And if you think about it, I went to this small OEM a few months ago, and there is no technology, there's no network, there's no connected assets, there's none of that. And so they really have this big hurdle to go through by just, okay, we need to read that information, the PLC information, into some sort of database and push it to the cloud to do something with it. But there's a big hurdle there to get started.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting. I know you had a chance to work in Europe for several years, and when you compare Europe and what they're doing there from your experience and here, what are some of the differences you see, and what could we learn from Europe, or what could Europe learn from the U.S. in terms of their approach to this?
So there's a couple different things. It's hard to answer that because it comes down to the individuals and the companies themselves. But some generalities that I witnessed was that in Europe there are stronger labor contracts, and people tend to stay at their jobs longer than they do in the U.S. 34 years ago, it was common for the U.S. employees to stay lifetime at a company. And in Europe, that still happens quite a bit. And so when you look at the Industry 4.0 execution or technology adoption, digitalization, if your workforce hasn't changed and you're implementing standardized software and tools, then it's easier because they're used to you coming around if you're part of the company, but you can make changes and you know that those people are going to stick around. And what I've seen often in the US is that it's more of a cost sheet item. And if the cost sheet is saying, okay, we're losing money, then everyone worries about, okay, am I going to lose my job? It's not everything everywhere, just a few examples, especially, you see layoffs mentioned in tech and stuff in these last months and all the things that have happened because of supply chain issues. People worry about keeping their jobs. If you go look at those same companies in Europe, chances are they didn't lay off. They found another way to utilize the people in an efficient way.
You think that's a function of the social systems that exist in the two different? I mean, in Europe is a much more focused on socialism and a lot broader support, for that kind of thing, or is it just a different approach from
It's
from a company perspective?
yeah, I think it may be just a different approach. So the democratic socialism that you have in Europe is a little different, of course, than the democracy you have in the U.S. or actual socialism. But there are a lot of things in place to help families and people to bridge any issues, which is really nice to have. But from a technology perspective, or from working in manufacturing, I think the people who work for these companies feel more confident of being able to stay there and long term being able to make a difference at the company.
Thank you for that. We have maybe, Mike, I can throw a question up that we have from an audience.
Yep, absolutely. Go for it.
So we had a question. David McLean asked the question, and I thought we may be able to answer that. In your experience, is 4.0 achievable with just technology, or do we need culture change first? In other words, will the technology change culture, or do we need a culture of continuous improvement first?
I think that you should view the culture as a change agent to adapting technology. It's not one or the other. It goes hand in hand. It's tandem, and being able to have a sustainable improvement requires adoption across the company, and so it should be going together.
Yeah, I have a friend who I always talk about, I have a sleep ring that I like to talk about, tracking my movement or lack of movement and sleep and such. Another friend who talks about the wearing a Fitbit, and he's worn it for a decade and he's put on 30 pounds. So to that point of having the data, but not having the culture of actually doing anything with it, I think plays into your point, Jane, and to David's question that it has to serve a purpose that you're willing to take action on.
Yes, and I would agree with that. In the past, working with operators and talking about a particular chemical problem on the board, and I've had many situations where they were reluctant to put on control what had been designed. I was like, you have complete control. You take it off anytime you want. I just want to know why. And then when it got to the point where they would call me and say, hey, it's not working, there's something wrong, I knew that I was successful in making that change. And I think that really having that true engagement will automatically change the culture as you're making improvements.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have, thank you for the thought on that. We have another question from Sandy that maybe I can put up here as well. It kind of focuses in on a particular technology. So with a focus on solving problems for the operator, what is Jane's experience of deploying connected worker solutions to digitize day-to-day execution, problem solving, and learning?
So we actually did a lot of that at Stanley Black & Decker. At Covestro, not quite so much. There was some mostly for like maintenance and turnaround activities. But at Stanley, we had we adopted tulip interfaces, and it was really nice because the first thought was, okay, we're going to get rid of paper. And I was surprised at this day and age walking into a factory and how much paper and sticky notes were available everywhere. And we started to, again, go to the operator and say, okay, what's your biggest pain point, or the line supervisor or whatever, and fix that problem. And once people realize, hey, this is cool, then we move on to the next problem. And with tulip interfaces, we were able to connect it to different systems and business systems and actually create like a virtual MES in between, but the primary focus had always been digitizing the shop floor and using that technology.
That's interesting. So it's interesting because today, everybody, I say everybody, I don't mean everybody, but in a lot of factories, most operators have cell phones that they use all the time. And so you this kind of idea of connected worker, it seems almost like, why aren't we,
And you'd be surprised. So like in the operators have their cell phones, but they may not have a user ID, a computer ID for the network. And so they can't use their personal devices on the network. And then there aren't maybe devices available for them to use. And then it could be that Wi-Fi is an issue. So there's all kinds of problems, when you're going into a factory for the first time and saying, okay, I want to do connected worker. You got to check all your IT stuff. You got to see what's available. Can operators actually log onto the system and things like that? So there's a lot of steps that are necessary to be successful.
So maybe, Jane, from your experience and back to the point, I think those are great questions from both David and Sandy. You talked about actually deploying, connected worker solutions and such. How was that handled from a leadership perspective, right? Was that essentially the plant management or the operations leadership saying, hey, the productivity and the safety of our workers is worth this being a focus area, and that ends up being a solution? Or, is it a corporate-led initiative? Or what's your experience with how these things are being justified? Because you can have other large organizations that aren't investing the same way here. So
we throughout my career, I've always looked at what's the dollar savings or benefit behind whatever it is that we're doing. And if we can save on greenhouse gases and improve safety while we're at it, even better. And so when we look at, say at Stanley Black & Decker, where we're trying to introduce Industry 4.0 at most of the sites, there were a few that were like showcase sites, but it wasn't prevalent, and trying to make improvements. So there was a leadership who didn't understand what was needed in order for that to work. So you have to present it in such a way that you're saying, okay, I'm going to save you $100 million over this amount of time by doing these changes, but you have to be able to count it. And all of that, if you think about it, if you're improving productivity, that could be that the plant manager is going to lose some of their budget. So it's always a negotiation. Right. And at Covestro, what we did was we looked at the overall OEE for the year around the world at all the sites, and calculated. We picked a bad year where there were several multi-week outages at different locations due to instrument failures or equipment failures, and calculated, okay, well, how much would that have been had that not happened? And so at Covestro, I went to the board when I was asked to digitalize manufacturing. It was like, well, if we had the right tools in place, these things wouldn't have happened, which would have made a big difference on the EBITDA on that year. And the same with Stanley Black & Decker. We calculate everything we do, even though it was tedious, and a lot of my team kind of pushed back on doing that extra work. When you take it to leadership and say, but here's the money we're saving, it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. And then you get that acceptance. So the top layers want to know how much money they're saving, or energy, or how they're being more efficient. And the workers want a job that's better than it was yesterday.
And then in your role specifically, I mean, is that the reason that you have somebody in your role that's a director or leader or VP of these types of initiatives to work across the different levels of the organization and different plants and such?
So when I was offered the position at Covestro in the executive leadership role, I was actually told that I was an experiment because I didn't come from the typical background of all the other leaders. I came from the control room, from the engineering pool, from and then the plant manager, and really worked my way up through these different roles. And so as an experiment, they're like, okay, we want to add you to the leadership team and see how we can utilize those skills and actually make a difference. And we had some really good experiences at Covestro because the head of global reliability and I kind of worked together on an overall solution, using these Industry 4.0 technologies and making them available.
That's great.
David had another question kind of along the path we're talking about here. Are there established partners out there for I-40 transformations, for example, Power BI, or are there mostly proprietary solutions?
I would say that there's quite a bit. So I joined Momenta last month as a venture partner, and so I get to spend all day looking at different technologies that are available, which is super fun. I recommend it to anyone who has the opportunity. But you're going to see a little bit of both. There's a lot of proprietary stuff especially with the bigger companies, and then the smaller companies are going to have solutions as well, and they're going to be flexible to work with you. So, and the question goes away, so I don't know if I can.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I think you got it. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I took it down.
Okay. So in my past, I always looked at we always had the big systems, the big DCS or safety systems or MES, and everything is very standardized, and that definitely has its place. But to be able to engage in folks, again, I met a lot of these folks like at conferences or online in different ways, to figure out how do you get away from that proprietary. I think it's really beneficial for small and medium enterprises. There are a lot of solutions out there, and trying to pick one that fits your culture and fits what you're looking for would be the next step.
It's interesting. I will share another comment from earlier from one of our co-founders, Grace Donovan. She lives up in Michigan, and she talks about the work that that's been done to support small and mid-sized manufacturers from the state itself. I know
Yes.
that I'm in South Carolina. It's the same thing. You can go to the MEP here, and they have access to grant money, and they can help you come up with the solutions you need. So I think there's a lot of partners out there that can also help you find the right solutions, and not necessarily it may be proprietary, or it could be something that's fairly common.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that Grace mentioned that. I was talking earlier this week with Scott Phillips, who is working in the I-40 accelerator, which is for Michigan, and we were talking a little bit about just what they're doing, having an exchange, and organizations like that are there to help the smaller enterprises. So thank you for bringing that up, Grace.
For sure. Mike, I wanted to sort of poke a little bit about, we had conversations with Jane earlier. We talked about language, Industry 4.0, Industry 5.0, that sort of stuff. And Mike and I had a visceral reaction to, run and hide from 5.0. But I know, Jane, you are plugged in with some initiatives around, what's beyond this. And specifically, I believe your perspective is the improvement on 4.0 is more focus on the operator, on the worker as well, putting the worker at the center of Industry 4.0 translates into the 5.0 conversations. Did I capture that correctly, or would you like to?
You captured one of the concepts correctly. Yes. So it's actually I was doing some reading earlier I had the privilege to meet Shauna Reagan, who's the head of the EU Commission for Industry 5.0, and he shared some information with me of work that they did developing the concept and working on that. And when you look at Industry 5.0, or maybe the origins of Industry 4.0, was to improve, use data and technology to improve the work life of people, as well as making sure things are more sustainable. And we kind of got away from the sustainability portion and the worker portion. Now, that might be a nice side effect, but it wasn't the focus. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at Industry 5.0, the focus needs to be, or is intended to be, on sustainability, human-centric, and then resiliency. So resilient supply chain and sustainable, meaning that if we're going to make something new, say build a new plant, how can we build it such that we're net zero? Not that we're not too bad, but that we actually are benefit, or even how do we benefit the planet as a whole by building this facility and things like that. A lot of those concepts it's hard for me to grasp what that would actually mean. That the one that sticks with me is the resiliency in the supply chain. So for however many years I've been working in manufacturing, it's all about, just in time and lean production and trying to be as efficient as you can so that your cost sheet each month was positive because things came in as you needed to make them and things went out and you sold them. But with the pandemic and the supply chain issues, you're seeing really a need for a resilient supply chain. And what does that look like going forward? We don't want to do what a lot of companies did and over order and then have this huge stock where they can't unload it all, and then the demand goes down because of inflation. If that sounds familiar at all. And actually, do that in a more deliberate way, such that you've always got a little bit, but you actually can use maybe AI to plan which things are going to sell better, where do we need to stock up more, and not just kind of do it all. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to truly define how do we take this technology that we've been proving works, and how do we make it better for the planet and better for people.
Well, that's great. And I when we first talked about it, I cringe at, at going from 4 to 5 to 6, and accelerating our conversation when people are trying to go from 2 to 3, right? Or try to, find where they are. And it's easy to lose sight of what you talked about from the beginning, the perspective from the operator, like where the pain is, where the opportunity for process improvement lies. It's easy to lose sight of that when we're taking off into the future and painting the next picture of the next big thing. So that's why I think it's really, really important to what you talked about. I think David had brought up as well, as culturally knowing like where technologies fit and know that they're going to continue to,
yes,
run away from us. But it's really core. You got to stay core to, the principles of manufacturing, right?
You really do. And if you were to look around my house, there's all kinds of books and documents and stuff about, improving manufacturing and change management and all that. And when Industry 5.0 came out, of course, there's not a book printed. So I've been reading a lot of information online, and Sean was happy to share some information with me. But I have found that I really have to educate myself before I can make an opinion on something. And without that, you're missing most of the conversation, because again, just like with Industry 4.0, I first heard Industry 5.0. I'm like, oh, not again. There's something else. And then I started doing all this research and reading about it and understanding better. It's about taking what we are doing, but actually make it better for people. That human-centric, or the benefit to the people is at the center of it, instead of just a cost line item or cost sheet line item.
That's good. Thanks for your perspective on Industry 5.0. I'm still probably candidly a little bit of a skeptic about, why don't we just do that with Industry 4.0,
because I think it was intended. Yeah.
But
that's what I'm starting to understand. Yes.
Yeah, makes sense. So we've talked about a lot of things. To kind of put a bow around a couple of things. What would you say are a couple of the principles of success for a company doing Industry 4.0? So you've seen a lot, you've read a lot, you alluded to that, you've learned a lot. If someone said, "Hey, what are the 2 or 3 things I got to make sure I do to be successful with Industry 4.0?" How would you answer that?
So for me, how I would answer it is it's really about all making those relationships. So understanding your IT business partner and knowing who does what and how to bring that together, and then making sure that you understand your leadership's perspective. What is it that they need in order to get agreements to agree to spending money on something, and then as before, talking to the people and finding out where are the real pain points. But I think that primarily it's about relationships and making sure that you utilize that network for making improvements, IT, OT integration, and then not being afraid to try something new.
I appreciate that. I think one of the things that you have to, I think you hit it, you said it a couple times during the session as well, is you have to realize you can't be the expert on everything. And
Yes.
in fact, the wisest companies, I think, don't try to be experts in the technology. They identify who they can go to who might be an expert in a particular technology, and they focus on, like you alluded to, solving the problems and reaching out to their partners when they think they might be able to help them.
Yeah, so I used to be very, an individual contributor and very focused on solving problems. And my motivation was if someone told me I couldn't do it, then by God, I was going to do it right. I was going to prove them wrong, that it was possible. But taking that to a different perspective, it's just there's so much that can be done, engaging people and doing that and making sure you do it right. But I've found that if I'm the smartest person in the room, then I've done something wrong. And my now thing, instead of being a DCS expert and FST programmer, so assembly language, if my expertise is now knowing who knows what, and how to bring those different people in and how to engage them and get them all on the same page. So regardless of who you work for, what's happening, or even what your degree is in, but what do you actually know and what do you add to the table?
That's super. Well, I think we're kind of reaching the end of our time together. Usually as we begin to wrap up, Mike, do you have a final question you might have for Jane or a final thought?
No, I mean, I said before, I mean, Jane's like a unicorn for us in this industry, right? Someone with actual plant experience and, from the operations level up through the executive level, seen operations here in the US, in Europe. So I think her perspectives are just fantastic. And I would probably go back to her point about, first of all, being very appreciative that she's here sharing like this. She talks about going to shows and networking and things like that. And here she is putting herself out there for others to learn from her. And I think she sets a great example on two fronts. One, for companies that should, mirror the behavior and get their folks networked and connected and engaged, as Jane has done. And then secondly, for herself, being one of those experts who's willing to be out there and share. I think that's a lesson for everybody, because I do think that the knowledge that we need is out there. It's really hard to get it in a pre-canned course you're going to go and take. But when you can make connections and learn from someone like Jane, I think it's a true blessing, and really appreciate the time that Jane's given us here today.
I would normally try to wrap up, Jane, with one final thought, but we did get one more question I thought was interesting, which we didn't touch upon.
Sure.
And I think it's worth sharing it on the screen. Ian asked us, with all the labor challenges we've been having and finding skilled labor, how does Industry 4.0 help us, or vice versa? How does the need or the shortage for labor drive Industry 4.0?
So it's a really good question, because there is definitely a labor shortage, and manufacturing is not going away, so you have to find a way to solve the problem. And what I've found, or is what I'm maybe it's more is what I'm hoping, is that as you're trying to, if you've got a shop floor and you've got all these people and you've got holes in it, well, if you look at that, how can you maybe automate something or do something in a more efficient manner using technology, and try and bridge the gap with technology? Instead of, people used to think that automation technology, you lose jobs, but there's got to be a way to augment those workers with technology to make them more efficient in their job and what they're doing, and doing that. And I think as we start to add more technology to factories and to plants, that the workforce needs to be upskilled as well, along with that technology, and that you'll be able to find different roles for those people who are engaged, to contribute from a technical perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think also, just to add to what you're saying, for a lot of, or for the folks that have grown up in the digital era, if you aren't using the technology, why would they want to work for you? So you've also got this as almost an attractivity
Right,
element as well, in many ways,
right. Yeah, I mean, everyone I know, like my son and all his friends in that age group in the late 20s, they're all way more technically savvy than I am, and probably ever was. And if you're in that age group and you want to go get a job, do you really want to work in a manual only assembly process or something like that? You want to, we need to gamify operations and manufacturing and make sure that it's interesting for the workforce to keep coming back every day.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback real quick on that. I mean, Jane mentioned a couple of times being a problem solver, and talked about the operators helping solve problems. And you look, business leaders are trying to solve problems. I really think the Industry 4.0 solutions give us the opportunity to allow people to solve problems on their own, at scale, right? And it used to be, to solve a problem, you'd custom engineer a solution and hardwire it, right? And
Yes.
Now hopefully we don't have to do that as much, and we can be much more nimble, and that innovation and problem solving can spread out more, and be more rewarding for folks that could just grab a problem, wrestle it to the ground, and keep going.
Yeah,
That's so great.
Grace shared one more thing that I think that was interesting. I'm sorry, I mean, not that. She talks about the idea of pairing older and younger generations on the shop floor as a way to help bring the less digitally savvy group, maybe. And I'm not saying that older folks aren't digitally savvy, but you could just say you're pairing folks that are less digitally savvy with those that are more digitally savvy, as a way to one, transfer knowledge, but two, also bring more openness to technology. So I thought that was interesting as well.
I think that makes sense. If you look back, in the 80s and 90s, and the way that the operators would train new people coming in is you would do exactly that. You would pair a seasoned operator with a newcomer, and they would spend months together, and the new person would be shadowing the older operator and trying to gather all that information. But you can absolutely do it the other way, as Grace is suggesting as well. You've got all this technology, and the many of the younger people are going to be savvy in that way and can contribute, and together it's, you're both learning from the other person, but a different aspect of the whole job.
Yeah.
One thing I hope we can do at some point is, for that experienced worker that knows how the plant sounds and smells and can tell what's going on, to me, that knowledge is, we have definitions of what a knowledge worker is, and those folks traditionally don't fit into that category. They're working with their hands and such. But wow, is the experience and the knowledge that they have in their heads and in their hands valuable? And if we can make it rewarding for them, and extract it from them, not in a way that we're doing it for self-preservation so we know how this line works, but so that we're actually realizing the value and giving you recognition, compensation, however that works, You talked about gamifying, however we can reward people for sharing that knowledge. I think there's such a wealth there that could be tapped into.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective, Mike. I didn't think of it that way because we've done a lot of like video recording and things like that of people who are getting ready to retire and things, but actually having additional rewards on top of expertise and knowing those nuances in the plant. I think that should be, a benefit in some way.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Jane, as we reach the end of the hour, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
Let's see. I was thinking about that, and I actually wrote something down that the conversation has been so good. The primary thing is that as you're moving on to your Industry 4.0 journey, technology is not enough. You've got to engage people. And for anyone who knows me or anyone who talks to me in the future, it's always going to be my first priority is where the people are. And utilizing data in humans as part of the feedback loop, I think is where you're going to get your results. So it's not just about the data, but actually the humans and the data and using that whole improvement cycle to get the most benefit out of it. And culture is its own problem-solving device. So it's not a one or the other. And then, the final thing is to look where humans are struggling to say, okay, this is where I need to start in this shop or on this line is where the humans having the most trouble here.
Wow, thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you for that summary. So as we wrap up here, I'd like to thank Mike and Jane both for joining us for this very insightful discussion, and thanks to everybody who joined us online. It's been great. David and Ian and Grace and Sam. It's been wonderful to have all and others engage with us in this discussion. So if you like these kind of conversations, please look for them on LinkedIn Live or LinkedIn Audio through our Industry 4.0 club or group page. We do host conversations on alternating weeks, focusing on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Typically, we'll talk about women in manufacturing. We'll do Fireside Chat. We'll talk about a future technology issue or people, process, and culture on one of those 2 days each week. Also, please join our LinkedIn page and visit our website at www.industry4.0club.com. So again, thanks, Jane. Thanks, Mike. And for everybody else who's with us today, we wish you a good rest of the day and a good week.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jane.